Robert Spencer, a wealthy and powerful CEO, was the kind of man who believed he could have anything he wanted. At the peak of his career, his life was filled with lavish parties, expensive cars, and an office in the heart of Manhattan. He had it all, except morals. And one day, that lack of conscience would come back to haunt him. It was 20 years ago when he met Monique, a young and intelligent black woman who had just started working as his secretary. She was hardworking, diligent, and, most importantly, she was beautiful. Robert noticed her almost immediately. At first, it was subtle. Compliments on her work, extended conversations during late nights at the office. But as the weeks passed, Robert's interest in Monique became less about her professional skills and more about his personal desires. Monique was ambitious and knew how difficult it was for a woman like her to make it in the corporate world. She had grown up in a struggling neighborhood and fought tooth and nail for every opportunity that came her way. Working for someone like Robert was a chance for her to finally achieve the financial security she'd been dreaming of. But she wasn't blind to the world she was in, and she could sense that Robert's attention was drifting from her work to something much more dangerous. One night, after an office party, Robert crossed the line. He made advances on Monique, and despite her attempts to push him away, he didn't stop. The relationship turned into a messy and secret affair. Monique, trapped between her need for the job and the fear of losing her career, stayed quiet. But months later, everything changed. Monique discovered she was pregnant. When she nervously told Robert, expecting at least some form of understanding, she was met with cold rejection. His perfect life didn't include the scandal of an illegitimate child, especially not one with his black secretary. He coldly ordered her to leave her position and never come back. Desperate, Monique begged him to reconsider, but Robert's heart had turned to stone. He cut all ties, firing her without so much as a severance check, and wiped her from his life. Monique disappeared, and Robert continued his life, marrying a wealthy socialite and living in the world of luxury he had always known. But Monique's life had been turned upside down. Left jobless, pregnant, and alone, she moved back to her hometown and did everything she could to survive. Her son, David, was born into a world of struggle, and though Monique did her best to shield him from the pain, the weight of what had been done to them was something that lingered like a dark cloud. She never spoke much about his father, only telling David the man who left them was someone he didn't need to worry about. Years passed, and while Monique managed to provide for her son, she could never forget what had happened. But life has a way of coming full circle. David grew up strong and intelligent, just like his mother, and as he matured, he began asking more questions about his father. Monique hesitated at first, but eventually, she told him the truth, the painful story of how a wealthy man had abandoned them both. David listened, but his expression remained calm, his mind calculating. 20 years later, Robert Spencer's life had settled into a comfortable routine. He had no memory of Monique or the child they had. That was a closed chapter in his book, one he never thought would be opened again. Until one afternoon, Robert sat in his office, the same one he had occupied for decades, overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. He was reviewing some business reports when his assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, there's a man here to see you," she said. Robert looked up, confused. "Do I have an appointment with him?" "No, sir, but he says it's urgent." Robert sighed. "Fine, send him in." The door opened and a tall, young black man entered, dressed in a sharp suit, his posture confident and his eyes piercing. There was something familiar about him, but Robert couldn't place it. The man stood silently for a moment, his gaze fixed on Robert, before finally speaking. "Do you remember Monique Harris?" The question hit Robert like a punch. His mind raced back to that period in his life. The affair, the pregnancy, the firing. His heart began to pound. "Who are you?" Robert asked, though he already had a sinking feeling in his gut. "I'm David, her son." "Your son?" the young man said coldly. The room seemed to freeze. Robert's face drained of color, his usually commanding presence now shattered. He stood up, eyes wide, words failing him. I didn't know," Robert stammered, his voice trembling. David raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but laced with years of pent-up emotion. "You didn't know? You didn't care." You threw my mother away like she was nothing, left us to fend for ourselves. But we survived. I survived. Robert tried to steady himself, his mind scrambling for something to say. Look, that was a long time ago. Things were different back then. I can make things right. David's eyes narrowed. Make things right? You think money will fix this? You think you can just write a check and it'll all disappear? Robert's mouth went dry. He had built his empire on the belief that money could solve any problem. But as he stood there, looking into the eyes of the son he had abandoned, he realized that this was one problem that money couldn't erase. David took a step closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. I didn't come here for money. I came here to let you know that you don't own me. You don't control my life, and you can't control what happens next. I'm here because I've built myself up without you, without your name or your help. Robert swallowed hard, realizing that no amount of power or wealth could undo what he had done. I'm sorry, Robert finally said, his voice barely audible. David didn't blink. You will be. With that, David turned and walked out of the office, leaving Robert standing alone, his world suddenly feeling much smaller and emptier than it ever had before. The walls seemed to close in as Robert sat back down at his desk, the weight of his past now heavier than ever. But the reckoning had just begun. As David left Robert's office, his last words echoed. Robert sat there, staring at the door that had just closed behind his son. The revelation shocked him. For the first time in decades, Robert felt vulnerable. He controlled everything in his life, his company, his wealth, and the people around him. But now, he couldn't control his past. The next few days were a blur. Robert tried to work, but thought about David. The guilt he had hidden for so long came back. He tried calling Monique, but the number was disconnected. He hired investigators to find her, but they couldn't trace her. One evening, Robert got a call from his lawyer. It was an odd time for a call, and Robert's heart pounded as he picked up the phone. Mr. Spencer, the lawyer began. I have disturbing news. What is it? Robert's voice was sharp, but he was afraid inside. It's about your company. There's a lawsuit. David Harris filed a claim against Spencer Enterprises. Robert was scared. What claim? He's not just filing for damages. He's claiming his mother was wrongfully terminated, discriminated against, and owes compensation for lost wages. Robert held the phone tightly. This can't be happening, he said. It's worse, the lawyer said. He's suing for punitive damages and emotional distress. This could go public. It's not just money. It could ruin your reputation. Robert slammed the phone down, feeling his empire crumbling. David was more than just a son seeking justice. He was determined to bring Robert's legacy to its knees. The lawsuit gained momentum over the next few weeks. News outlets picked up the story. CEO faces lawsuit from estranged son over decades-old scandal. Robert's name was everywhere, and the media frenzy grew as more details of his affair with Monique emerged. His board members and investors were unhappy. His image was now tainted, and his empire was crumbling. In the chaos, Robert was alone in his penthouse, looking out over the city he ruled, the city where he had risen to power. It all felt hollow. He had been rich for years, but now he felt poor. One night, Robert made a decision. He called David. David answered. I want to meet, Robert said, his voice weak. Please. After a long silence, David said, Fine. Tomorrow. My office. The next day, Robert came to David's office. He wasn't the most powerful man there. David sat at the desk, calm. Robert was a shadow of his former self. I don't know what you want, but I'll make it right. I'll give you what you need. Money, shares, control. Stop. Please. David looked at him for a moment before speaking. It's not about the money, Robert. It's about accountability. You spent your life doing whatever you wanted, hurting anyone who got in your way. This lawsuit isn't just for me. It's for my mom. You destroyed her life when you discarded her. Robert felt the impact of his words. I know. I made mistakes. Believe me. I'm sorry. David's expression didn't change. Sorry doesn't fix this. You changed our lives. My mother struggled for years because of you. She died 3 years ago. Did you know that? Robert's breath caught. No, I didn't. Of course you didn't, David said. She died without justice. I'll make sure she gets it. Robert's head hung low. David's eyes showed no redemption. He wanted justice for his mother. You'll lose everything, Robert, David said. Not just your money, but your name and your legacy. This is how it ends. Robert Spencer realized he couldn't stop it. He left David's office, knowing his empire would soon be destroyed.